If you're new to SharePoint workflows, it might be hard to imagine the sort of volume that you'll have to maintain as you have more and more workflows running in your organization. When you have one workflow and you need to update it frequently, it's usually not that big of a deal. But when you have 12 workflows or dozens of workflows or 100 workflows and you need to maintain them, you've just created a full-time job. So from the very beginning, I want to encourage you to do the kind of thinking about workflow creation that would make your workflows very easy to maintain. And one of those is to make sure that in areas where the business is volatile, you're not hard coding things that you'll later regret. An example of that is anyone's email address. For example, here, Greg Hurian is the person who's the contact for the payroll department. So we've just put in here, email Greg to notify him we have a new employee. Same thing with Janet. Hey, send Janet an email. And then send Ginny an email. But what happens when any of these folks get promoted or leave the company or simply decide that it would be better to have one of their underlings or minions manage all these emails rather than doing it themselves? So what I'd like to encourage you to do is to develop email aliases that you use and never hard code someone's name in here unless there's absolutely no way around it. So you're going to be having a really good relationship with your Microsoft Exchange administrator because they're the folks who set up aliases and then direct them to specific accounts. Let me show you what I mean. For example, there's normally someone who is in charge of the workflow. It's theirs. If you're creating a workflow for a business area, it's probably the person who is in charge of that particular piece of functionality. So if it's employee onboarding, it might be somebody in the human resources department. If it's something to do with expenses, it's probably somebody in accounting. But whoever that person is, rather than include their email address, I actually want to set up an email address that would work for them. And for workflow owners, so that I can immediately spot those emails to them, what I like is to set up an alias that starts with a lowercase WFO and then has the name of the workflow because they don't own all workflows, they own one. So for example, the person in HR who owns employee onboarding, I would make changes only if they asked, might be WFO, uppercase E employee, and then uppercase O onboarding at my organization name. So WFO employee onboarding at twotreesoliveoil.com. Then there's somebody whose job is to administer the workflow. This is typically somebody in your information technology department. If there's a problem with the workflow, they're the folks who are going to follow up on it and make sure that if it's stopped, that it gets restarted. If it needs some work, that they contact a developer. And usually those folks are WFA for workflow admin. If you have one person who's in charge of administering all of your workflows and you know it's going to stay that way for a while, you might do simply WFA at twotreesoliveoil.com. Or if you have a few workflows already or have a list of workflows waiting for you to actually draft them and different people would administer them, then you would want to do WFA, the workflow name, so WFA employee onboarding at twotreesoliveoil.com. This is a conversation in your IT department because you could always use WFA at twotreesoliveoil and have that then alias to an entire group. Workflow developers, WFDs. I use this only for testing. WFD is not an ongoing role, but that means that if you generate an email and it comes across as WFD and you're now actually working on that workflow, that you probably have an issue somewhere that needs to be resolved. So I'll usually say WFD, and that's a testing ID. You could also have WFQA if you have somebody who does a QA role in your organization for testing, because once you've created your workflows, if they're reusable, you can move them from your development environment to your QA environment to your production environment. So developer and QA roles should have their own email addresses. And then let's look at what this means then in the business, because these are the folks who are trying to prevent having lots and lots of emails coded directly to them. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the payroll department. It might be that there's one person who's in charge of getting all of the emails from workflows. So that would be WF payroll at twotreesoliveoil.com, our workflow contact. But it could also be that we're going to have different people for different workflows. And in that case, you're going to have WF, the name of the workflow, and the name of the department. So imagine that we have, for a department contact in the payroll department for employee onboarding, WF employee onboarding payroll at twotreesoliveoil.com. It's a huge email address, but when you have your conversation with your IT folks who are in charge of your Microsoft Exchange server or whatever email server you're using, if you explain to your Exchange administrator that you're trying to make workflows that are easy to maintain, despite the fact that you have people moving from one job to another, and that it will mean that you will not have to be involving them with setting up new emails all the time as people come in and changing the emails that particular people receive, they're usually fairly receptive to this. So again, by using these aliases, and I'm now going to use WFO workflow name, let's go back now and say, okay, instead of emailing Greg Huron in payroll then, what we'd be doing is we'd be saying, well, this is a workflow for employee onboarding, and this is the payroll person at twotreesoliveoil.com. Greg for now, but someone else later on. Changed so easily simply by letting the Exchange administrator know, hey, that WF employee onboarding payroll address now goes to Janet, not to Greg any longer. This is how you use email aliasing and a system of really smart aliasing to make sure that you don't have to come back in and modify this workflow every single time personnel change.